I just want to take a moment to thank you all for being here and watching, liking and commenting on the videos. Your support and engagement means so much, and over the years it's been amazing to see the Briefcase community grow. A special thanks to all the channel members, whose names are listed here. Your support is very much appreciated and helps support the channel. And if any of you would like to become a member, I have left a link below. Today we will be looking at 4 cases from 4 different countries from the 19th and early 20th centuries. Zelda Ward was born in the countryside near Seattle, in the US state of Washington, in 1875. Her father owned a farm in Kings County, and his hard work had meant that she experienced a comfortable upbringing. She was a pretty child and grew into a beautiful young lady who had many admirers. Men would always glance over their shoulders when she walked by, and there were many who wanted to court her. She soon became known as Belle. She was elegant and sophisticated, and it seemed that she would have the pick of all the eligible young men. Everyone presumed that she would enjoy a comfortable life with one of them. Belle, however, was someone who wanted to marry for love, and marrying into one of the county's more distinguished families was not something that she considered important. Instead, in 1895, she married a far less affluent gentleman named Anson A. Adams. At just 19 years old on her wedding day, she was considered quite a young bride, as at the time the average age for a young woman to marry was 22. At first the marriage was good, and Belle gave birth to a baby, but soon the relationship with her husband started to go downhill. And when things didn't improve, Belle found it difficult to cope as a wife and a mother. Although her situation was unhappy, her options seemed limited. Divorce at the time was rare, with less than 1% of marriages ending that way, mainly because there was still a social stigma attached to it. Furthermore, there were few opportunities available to divorced women, particularly those with children. Belle knew all too well that such a path often led to economic hardship. The answer to her marital problems resolved themselves in a very different way when in August 1896, gold was discovered in the Klondike region of the Yukon Territory in northwest Canada. This news soon reached Seattle and San Francisco and led to a rush of gold prospectors travelling to the area. One of the men who went, in the hope of finding his fortune, was Belle's husband, Mr. Anson A. Adams. Yet the competition among these prospectors was fierce, and the rigours of gold prospecting made for a challenging existence. The influx of fortune seekers was so substantial in the area that the once modest town of Dawson, which had only 500 residents in 1895, witnessed an astonishing surge in population. By 1898, it had swelled to 30,000 inhabitants. With her husband now searching for gold, Belle soon discovered that being married and a mother hadn't made her any less attractive to the young men of Kings County. She started to go out more, and it did not take long for her to meet a musician from Kansas City named Charles Kincaid, who everyone referred to as Charlie. He was 5 years older than Belle, having been born in 1870, and like her, he was also married. His first wife had died, but Charles had married again. He was also the father of 2 young children. When he married for the second time, he left the USA and moved to Canada, settling in the small town of Nelson in British Columbia, which is about 65 kilometres north of the Canada-US border. But this marriage had difficulties, and he had moved to the city of Victoria, where there was an abundance of work for talented musicians like him, who could play the piano, the guitar, and the banjo. The Canadian economy was improving, following the Great North American Depression that had started in 1893. Farm production had increased, as has industrialisation, and of course the gold rush had meant that many men stopped in Victoria before setting off on their 3,000-kilometre trip to seek gold in the Klondike. Belle soon fell for Charlie. He had such a charming manner, which she found difficult to resist. So she left her child with her mother and accompanied him to Victoria. Charlie was mixed race and a very likeable character. He and Belle soon became familiar faces around the streets of the city, but they are often seen to be embroiled in heated arguments. On one occasion, Belle packed a trunk and threatened to leave him. Charlie refused to let her go, saying before she did, she would have to return some rings that he had given her. but despite these frequent quarrels and recurring conflicts, their bond remained strong and they always found a way to reconcile. While Charlie would play the guitar, piano and banjo most nights at a venue in Yate Street, Belle would work as a prostitute. In late 19th century Canada, prostitution was quite prevalent in urban city centres. Many operated discreetly in brothels, roaming houses, or on the streets. Legal regulations varied depending on the province. In some areas, activities associated with prostitution were tolerated, while in others, they were more strictly regulated. The societal view of this industry was mixed. Some considered it to be a social issue, while others acknowledged the economic realities that drove women to the profession, many of whom only engaged in prostitution due to limited employment opportunities and economic hardship. In Victoria at the time, prostitution was generally accepted, although authorities did have the legal power to impose fines and imprisonment on both sex workers and their clients, though these measures were rarely enforced. While living in Victoria, Charlie and Belle stayed in a few different lodging houses, but by May 1898, they were living in the front room on the second floor at the Empire Hotel on Johnson Street. This part of the city had become known for its brothels, saloons, and entertainment venues. Gas lamps and dimly lit streets cast a shadowy ambience, with women in provocative attire soliciting clients. It had become known for illicit activities, and those who worked in the industry were seen as both a social issue and a source of fascination, although the authorities knew that they had to try and improve the reputation of the area. By now, it was becoming quite evident that Charlie and Belle's relationship had become quite strained. Their arguments continued, and Belle believed that Charlie was seeing someone else. Eventually, the manager of the hotel told him that if he wished to keep his room, he must cease his relationship with Miss Adams. Charlie obliged with this request and told her that she could no longer stay at the hotel, but he did assist her in acquiring alternative lodgings. Hotel staff were instructed not to give Miss Adams access to his room. However, Belle was a resilient and clever young woman. On the 2nd of June, a Thursday, she skillfully persuaded the porter to grant her access to the small room she once shared with Charlie. Her hope was to retrieve some of her belongings. Yet as she opened the door, her heart sank in horror. Charlie had already taken up with another young woman. An altercation occurred between them, which resulted in Belle being removed from the premises. The hotel manager then reminded his staff that she was not to be allowed to enter the hotel again. At 9 p.m. the following day, Friday the 3rd of June 1898, Charlie was returning to his room. He seemed in good spirits. He was carrying a cane and gloves and smiled at the staff as he entered the lobby. As usual, he whistled as he made his way upstairs. When he opened the door and entered his room, Belle was sitting by the window waiting for him. Shortly after, hotel guests became aware of a passionate disagreement between them. A man's voice resonated, declaring his intention to sever ties with her, having found someone else. The woman implored him not to leave, her voice trembling with trepidation. A hush then fell over the scene for a few seconds before Mr. Charles Kincaid emerged from the room. He stumbled down the hotel stairs and onto the sidewalk, his hand clutching his bleeding throat. Blood soaked his shirt and jacket. Former police constable Frank Bevan urgently called out for someone to fetch a doctor and went to assist the injured man. Charlie managed to get up momentarily, but soon fell once more. As he did, he uttered the words, "My God, she's killed me." It was noted that a fair-haired young woman had followed him out of the hotel. In her hand, she carried a white-handled razor that was covered with blood. Upon hearing the commotion, Samuel Hardman, who had been drinking in the hotel bar, swiftly intervened. Having seen the young woman holding the razor in her trembling hand, he pushed her to the wall. Realizing that she was clearly distressed, he asked her for the weapon, and without a struggle she relinquished it, her voice quivering as she uttered, "Take the razor, I did it." The young woman then rushed to Charlie's side, kneeling beside him and tenderly kissing his lips. She turned to the onlookers, explaining, "I did it. I didn't mean to do it. I did it for love. He drove me to it." Moments later, Dr. Fraser arrived. but after a brief examination, he sorrowfully declared that Mr. Charles Kincaid was dead. The body of the deceased man was taken back into the hotel before being transferred to the mortuary. The young woman was then escorted to the police station by Constable Anderson and Constable Redgrave. Here she told officers that her name was Miss Belle Adams and admitted what she had done. She then expressed her desire to die with her lover. The following morning at 10 o'clock, a coroner's court convened. The jury viewed the deceased body before proceeding to the Empire Hotel, to the room where the tragic incident unfolded. The deceased man's banjo and guitar were laid out on the bed, a poignant testament to his musical talents. Traces of blood stained the floor and the walls. A sizable crowd had gathered at the court, curious to catch a glimpse of the young woman who had committed this terrible act, and when she appeared, many noted her striking appearance. As witnesses recounted the events of the previous day, Belle wept. When the evidence concluded, the jury held her accountable for the murder, and the judge informed her that she would be tried for the crime. After a series of postponements, the trial of Miss Belle Adams eventually started on the 5th of October 1898. For many, it seemed like a very straightforward case. The young woman had killed her ex-lover at the Empire Hotel in a jealous rage after learning that he was now in a relationship with another woman named Rita Carmen. The prosecution outlined the events that happened at around 9 p.m. on Friday the 3rd of June and introduced a number of witnesses, some who had seen Belle enter the hotel and others who had seen her follow Charles down the stairs with the razor in her hand. Many of those who testified repeated their testimonies from the coroner's courts, but the prosecution also introduced witnesses who were able to confirm that on a number of occasions they had heard Miss Adams threaten to kill Mr. Kincaid if he ever left her. The press always depicted the events of that fateful night as a situation involving a jealous woman who could not accept that her lover had met someone else. The prosecution had followed the same narrative, but the defence introduced a strikingly different perspective and presented some very intriguing witnesses of their own. One was a man named Mr. William Burns, who was the owner of the Burns guest house. He told of how when the defendant was staying there with Mr. Kincaid, they would frequently argue, and that he was often called upon to separate them. He said that on one occasion, Mr. Kincaid had thrown Miss Adams onto the bed and was choking her. Mr. Burns added that Mr. Kincaid only desisted from doing this when he threatened to call the police. He went on to say that Miss Adams took some time to recover from the ordeal. When Mr. Burns was asked if Mr. Kincaid was violent towards Miss Adams on other occasions, he said that indeed he was. He told the court that once when they were arguing about money, he heard Mr. Kincaid say that if he had a razor, he would do for her. When Miss Adams took the stand, a sense of anticipation and enthusiasm swept through the courtroom. Her words were delivered in a hushed tone, prompting the judge to often request that she speak more audibly. She explained that she had ended the relationship with Mr. Charles Kincaid and went to the hotel room on the 3rd of June at his request. She said that he went out for a few hours, and when he returned he was angry. An argument followed. He grabbed the razor and attempted to attack her. She was speaking in a very controlled manner, although her voice was emotional. It was clear to the courts that recounting the events of that night brought back traumatic memories. Miss Adams went on to say that she managed to wrestle the blade from Mr. Kincaid's hands and he dropped it on the table. Fearing that if he picked it up he may kill her, she grabbed it and cut him. She said that it was all done in self-defense. When she was cross-examined, Belle was very composed and answered all the questions in a concise way. The prosecution counsel asked her about a conversation that she had had with Police Constable Redgrave and Police Constable Anderson on the 3rd of June. They alleged that she had told them that she had said to Mr. Kincaid not to make her vicious, to which he responded by telling her to go away, as he now had a girl that he liked better. Miss Adams looked down for a moment and then confirmed that she may have said this. When asked what happened that night, Miss Adams said that they began to argue, as she had questioned as to why he had told her that he would be out for only half an hour, but then did not return for 2 hours. She asked him if he had been drinking, to which he replied, "Not much." They continued to quarrel before he tried to attack her. It was noted by those inside the courtroom that she had responded to the prosecution's questions with remarkable precision and a high level of credibility. Another witness was a hack driver who informed the court that in the May of 1898 he had been asked to move a trunk for the deceased, and when talking to him, Mr. Kincaid told him that if Miss Adams did not look out for herself, he would kill her. When the trial ended, the jury was sent out to deliberate. Excitement and tension filled the court, with the expectation of an imminent verdict. The jury, however, took some time to carefully review the evidence and come to a decision of whether Miss Adams was guilty or innocent of the crime for which she was accused. When they returned to the courtroom, they found the defendant, Miss Belle Adams, guilty of manslaughter. They did not believe that her actions had been premeditated. Justice Irvine then sentenced her to 5 years in prison, to be served at the Kingston Penitentiary. An eerie silence filled the courtroom, as while many did not consider the crime premeditated, the fact remained that she had taken the life of Mr. Kincaid, and a much more severe sentence had been anticipated. In December of the same year, Belle's husband, Mr. Anson Adams, secured a legal separation from her. He stated that his wife was a convict, and Belle offered no defence. He was then given custody of their child. He had returned from the goldfields when he learnt that his wife was in jail facing the charge of murder. It is believed that he contributed generously to the expenses incurred during the trial. As the media and public interest in the case became less prevalent, people started to wonder if Belle was truly guilty. She was a petite young woman, and many believed that she would not have been able to inflict such a wound on a powerful man, such as Charles Kincaid. Some believe another may have been responsible. The second case is from 1840s New Zealand. Joseph Burns was born in Liverpool, England, in the year 1805, into an Irish family that had migrated to the bustling city in search of better opportunities. The economic landscape of Ireland during this period was primarily agrarian, characterised by low wages, harsh living conditions, and unjust land ownership practices, which drove numerous rural inhabitants to seek refuge elsewhere. The plight of tenant farmers in Ireland was worsened by land disposition, leading to resistance and resentment against oppressive landlords. Additionally, political unrest during events like the 1798 rebellion and the Act of the Union in 1801 heightened discord. Discriminatory laws against Catholics further exacerbated religious strife, prompting many to seek religious freedoms and equality in other countries. The journey undertaken by the parents of Joseph mirrored that of many Irish immigrants who crossed the sea, seeking improved economic prospects during a time of hardship in Ireland. At the time of his birth, Liverpool was a thriving port city, bustling with trade. Ships crowded the docks, loading and unloading goods, showcasing the city's importance in global commerce. However, many of the workers lived in very poor conditions, which highlighted the complexities of urban life in the early 19th century. Joseph had a very basic education. In 1810, schools for the working class in England were limited and often insufficient. Children from poor families had little access to formal schooling due to financial constraints and societal expectations. While charity schools aimed to provide some education, they were few in number and typically focused on rudimentary literacy and religious instruction rather than comprehensive learning. As a result, literacy and numeracy rates remained low among the poor, resulting in a significant portion of the population unable to read and write proficiently. Children from poor families often started working at a very young age, as they were expected to contribute to the family's income. Joseph started to work as soon as he was able, and from about the age of 12, secured an apprenticeship as a carpenter. In 1825, he joined the Navy, where he had to undertake arduous tasks and was often exposed to harsh weather conditions. However, within this disciplined environment, he underwent rigorous training and adhered to stringent regulations enforced by officers. In July 1840, he was stationed on the ship HMS Buffalo, which journeyed to Bay of Islands in New Zealand. The Bay of Islands held strategic significance as a key trading post and a site of early European settlement. It was a hub for whaling, fishing and the timber trade, attracting missionaries and settlers from around the world. Like all the crew of HMS Buffalo, Joseph appeared to be enjoying his time there. However, on the 28th of July 1840, a violent storm struck the area, and while anchored in Mercury Bay and laden with cargo, the ship was wrecked. The fierce gale-force winds severed her cables, leaving the crew powerless to prevent her fate. With no alternative left, the decision was made to intentionally run the ship aground. Fortunately, the majority of the crew managed to escape unharmed, although tragically, 2 died, and the vessel itself suffered irreparable damage. It was no longer seaworthy, and it was decided that it would not be economically viable to attempt to repair it. After the unfortunate incident, Joseph made the decision to leave the Navy and settle in New Zealand. At first he worked on a farm, but he soon gained notoriety for his heavy drinking. He always attributed this to persistent headaches, which he had suffered following an injury that he had incurred after a fall from a ship's mast. Despite his headaches, his problems with alcohol, and his short temper, he found companionship with a lady named Margaret Reardon, a woman whose life was marked by her own hardship and adversity, long before she crossed paths with Mr. Joseph Burns. Married at a young age and living in Australia, she had found herself entangled in a tumultuous relationship that was fraught with difficulties. The strains of marital discord led to her eventual separation from her husband and her emigration to New Zealand, a decision made in pursuit of a better life for herself. After she met Joseph, they settled together in a modest shack in Mechanics Bay that Joseph himself had built. Over the next few years, Margaret gave birth to 2 sons. However, life for the couple was not easy. Joseph was always in and out of work. In 1845, he was working as a stockman, and although he worked hard, he was dismissed following an altercation with his foreman. He was perceived by many in the local community as an unrefined and coarse character, and there seemed to be a general air of caution surrounding him. Consequently, after the incident, some were hesitant to offer him employment. Eventually, however, he managed to secure work on the North Shore, labouring on the farm of Mr. James Harp. But Joseph never seemed to be far away from trouble, and his time with Mr. Harp was marred by controversy. In early 1847, allegations of theft and the unauthorised slaughter of livestock led to his abrupt dismissal. He and his family were unceremoniously evicted from the farm cottage, leaving them in a very difficult situation. Determined to provide for his loved ones, he took matters into his own hands. Using whatever resources he could gather, he erected a modest dwelling near Shoal Bay. This was an area where European settlers had established brickworks, as well as sawmills, that profited from the logging in the forests of the southern North Shore. But times were tough for Joseph Burns. He intermittently worked, and he only received a meagre income. Fortunately, this was supplemented by vegetables grown and sold by his common-law wife, Margaret Reardon. Despite the adversity they faced and their harsh situation, the couple persevered and tried to provide as best they could for their 2 children. In the early hours of the 22nd of October 1847, the ship, HMS Dido, was at anchor off the coast of the North Shore. Benjamin Baker, the ship's diligent quartermaster, was on duty when he noticed an unsettling sight, a flicker of flames coming from the direction of the North Shore Naval Base. Without hesitation, he promptly informed his captain, who ordered a team ashore to assess the situation and offer assistance if required. Upon reaching the scene, they were met with a sombre sight: the cottage belonging to Lieutenant Snow, a gentleman who 6 years earlier had been the first signalman appointed to the naval base in Devonport, was ablaze against the night sky. Despite their efforts, the fire proved too fierce to control. The roof was thatched with raupo stalks and had already caved in. Despite at first believing that the occupants of the house had escaped, concern grew as no trace of them could be found. Once the flames subsided, a grim discovery awaited them. Amidst the rubble laid the charred bodies of Lieutenant Snow, his wife, and their daughter Mary, who was 6 years old. Mr. and Mrs. Snow's other daughter was in Auckland, under the care of a lady named Mrs. Cooper. After the formal identification of the bodies, an inquest took place at the Caledonia Hotel. Suspicion soon fell upon Lieutenant Snow's strained relationship with the local Maori community, with reports of prior altercations adding weight to the grim possibility. Testimony from Thomas Duda, who who was a signalman at the naval base in Devonport and who had witnessed the fire from a distance, claimed to have also observed 2 Maori canoes in the vicinity, as did Benjamin Baker, who was a quartermaster on duty on the HMS Dido. He said he saw a small boat making its way upriver, with a light like that of a candle or a lantern, heading in the direction of Lieutenant Snow's house. Mr. William Oliver, who resided about a quarter of a mile from the house, told the inquest that he had seen the deceased gentleman the day before the fire. He added that Mr. Snow had had a quarrel with some local Maoris about 18 months or 2 years previous, but had never mentioned anything since, and he himself had not seen anyone suspicious in the area. James Hart recounted how he had seen Lieutenant Snow at Mr. Graham's store 2 weeks prior to his demise. During the inquest, he told how the gentleman had informed him of an incident where he had to chase some Maoris from his garden after discovering that a loaf of bread had been stolen from his kitchen table. William Banks Fagan, who was the surgeon on the ship HMS Dido, gave evidence. He said that although all the bodies were badly burned, he could see on the male that there were 3 wounds on the neck, made by a sharp instrument with considerable force. He added that the edges of these wounds were charred, which proved that the fire was started following the attack. He said that in his opinion, these wounds were sufficient to have caused the death of Lieutenant Snow. Dr. Clifford, the assistant staff surgeon, had also examined the bodies and agreed with Dr. William Banks Fagan. He added that the wounds on the deceased gentleman's arms were probably caused by him trying to ward off the blows from his assailant. The inquest returned a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. Now the search for truth and justice commenced amidst the subdued atmosphere that enveloped the North Shore. However, the local Maori leaders found no evidence that this crime had been committed by one of their own, and the investigation into this most terrible crime started to stall. Eventually, Margaret Reardon reached breaking point in her relationship with Joseph Burns. Despite her efforts, his struggles with alcohol persisted, exacerbating their domestic turmoil. Furthermore, his inconsistent employment situation added to an instability to their household. Fearing for her safety and the well-being of their children, Margaret made the difficult decision to leave him. She sought refuge with her sister, Mrs. Sophia Aldwell, who lived in Shortland Crescent. It was there that she hoped to find sanctuary from the life that she had endured with Joseph. In an attempt to prove to Margaret that he could work, Joseph enlisted to sail in the naval steamer HMS Inflexible, embarking on a journey to Australia that departed on the 6th of November 1847. However, his return to Auckland on the 11th of December brought unexpected consequences. In a desperate attempt to salvage his relationship and reconcile with Margaret, on the 28th of December, he visited her at her sister's house and proposed marriage. However, resolute in the decision to leave him, she firmly rejected his proposal. Fueled by a mixture of rage and alcohol, he unleashed a violent attack on her, leaving the poor lady severely injured. Then, consumed by guilt and despair, he attempted to end his own life. However, he was unsuccessful and instead was swiftly apprehended by the authorities and charged for his attack on Margaret. He was tried at the Supreme Court on the 1st of March 1848, and following a short trial and a remarkably brief deliberation of a mere 12 minutes, the jury reached a unanimous verdict, finding him guilty of inflicting grievous bodily harm upon Margaret Reardon. The following day, the judge pronounced his sentence, a lifetime of transportation to Van Diemen's Land, the colonial name for present-day Tasmania, which everyone thought would bring a tragic conclusion to a relationship marred by violence and instability. However, in an unexpected turn of events, Joseph Burns made a curious request for Margaret to visit him with their 2 sons before his impending transportation. Despite her apprehensions, she complied. However, somehow, Mr. Burns managed to manipulate her during their meeting. Under his influence, she found herself coerced into providing false testimony. Both Joseph and Margaret made a confession to the authorities, stating that Thomas Duda and William Oliver, former shipmates of Joseph during his time on the HMS Buffalo, were responsible for the tragic murder of Lieutenant Snow and his family on the 22nd of October 1847. Both men were then arrested. However, during the investigation, it was concluded that they had not been responsible. The magistrate said that the statement from Margaret Reardon must be viewed with a degree of caution, as she was a woman of notoriously bad character, and the fact that Mr. Oliver had replaced Mr. Burns when he was dismissed from his position as a stockman could have resulted in much ill feeling between them. During these proceedings, and while in prison, Joseph again attempted to take his own life, but again he failed. Following this, Margaret Reardon recanted her statements and now blamed Joseph Burns for the crime. She maintained that, driven by desperation for money, he committed the gruesome murders of Naval Lieutenant Robert Snow, his wife and daughter. Allegedly, Mr. Burns sought the £12 in naval pay kept within their home and carried out the brutal act using an axe they had in their house. Joseph Burns, a man awaiting transportation, was now formally charged for the heinous crime of murder, and speculation arose that he had harboured intentions of marrying Margaret and been so distraught when she had refused him, as he was aware that were she his wife, she would be unable to testify against him. However, circumstances had shifted dramatically. Margaret, a woman who had previously been described as someone of a notoriously bad character, now found herself in the unexpected role of the chief prosecution witness. The trial began on Thursday the 1st of June 1848, and Joseph Burns pleaded not guilty. Margaret Reardon had stated that he had left in the early hours of the 22nd of October 1847, armed with a tomahawk and an axe, with the intention of committing this most terrible crime. She had also said that he was disappointed when there was only £12 in the house, and that he had expected to have found considerably more. The prosecution told the court that the tomahawk had since been discovered at the defendant's residence, and an examination had confirmed that it had bloodstains upon it. Margaret Reardon's sister, Mrs. Sophia Aldwell, provided compelling testimony during the trial. She recounted witnessing Joseph Burns' brutal assault on Margaret, vividly recalling his threatening words. She said that he shouted that he would do for her, so she would not tell any tales upon him. This damning evidence shed further light on the volatile nature of Joseph Burns' character and his determination to silence any potential witnesses against him. When the trial ended, the jury was sent out to deliberate, but they returned soon after to find the defendant guilty of the terrible murder of Lieutenant Robert Snow, his wife Hannah, and their 6-year-old daughter Mary. When asked if he had anything to say, the defendant looked at the jury and said, "The best of all things that I am innocent. I am as innocent as a child unborn." The judge, Chief Justice William Martin, then sentenced him to death. As he was being escorted from the court, he carried on proclaiming his innocence. On the 17th of June 1848, following a full confession that also implicated Margaret Reardon, Joseph Burns was escorted from the jail under heavy guard. He was taken across the harbour to the very site of his heinous crime, where, surrounded by a sizable crowd of settlers and Maori, he met his fate at the gallows. His execution marked a significant milestone in New Zealand's history, as he became the first European to be hanged there for a capital crime. In September 1848, Margaret Reardon faced trial for the wilful and corrupt perjury related to accusations against Thomas Duda. She pleaded not guilty. In a statement read by Supreme Court Registrar Thomas Outhwaite, Margaret detailed threats she had received from Joseph Burns and appealed for mercy for the sake of her children. The jury, however, swiftly found her guilty, and she was sentenced to transportation to Van Diemen's Land for 7 years. Chief Justice Martin emphasised that no external or internal influences could excuse such a reprehensible crime. Margaret Reardon was transported to Van Diemen's Land on the 23rd of September 1848. Her 2 children were then taken in by her sister, Mrs. Sophie Aldwell, and they went with her to California when she emigrated there in 1849. For the third case, we stay in the 1840s, but travel to the USA. Maria Dunn was born in 1822 in Old Town, a small parish near the city of Bangor in Maine. She was the daughter of poor but respectable parents. She received some education and was always considered to be a very pleasant child. When she was 15 years old, the US economy started to decline. There was a decrease in cotton prices, a collapse in land values, and a restriction on lending. This led many investors to panic, and people were anxious to retrieve their money from banks. On the 10th of May 1837, some banks in New York ran out of gold and silver, and some payments were suspended. This was followed by a recession, in which nearly half of all the banks failed. Businesses closed, and there was mass unemployment. By now, Maria and her parents had moved from Old Town and into Bangor, a small city on the east coast that had a booming lumbering industry and had become one of the largest lumber ports in the world. Despite the recession across most of the United States, Bangor continued to grow. Like so many other people, Maria's parents found life difficult during this period of economic hardship, especially during the winter, when the cold and snow made conditions even more challenging. Maria was now becoming a young woman and was aware that young gentlemen would often seek to make her acquaintance. She was very attractive and liked the attention bestowed upon her. One young gentleman who seemed very much infatuated by her was a doctor. He had money, and although his intentions may have been honourable, Maria treated the relationship more like a business. They continued to see each other throughout winter and spring, and the young doctor provided her with money and fine dresses. But Maria's mother was very upset by her daughter's behaviour and wanted her to settle down with an honest and worthy man. Although still only 16 years old, she did as her mother wished and married Mr. James Bickford, a well-respected young gentleman who worked as a bootmaker. They lived together for nearly 3 years, when following a visit to see friends in Boston, Maria decided to leave her husband. She had become frustrated by her modest life in Bangor and was fascinated with the big city, the shops, cafes, boulevards and parks, as well as the elegant ladies parading themselves in the most fashionable dresses. When she arrived in Boston, she stayed in a boarding house, and she soon caught the attention of a young man. Not long after, she travelled with him to Newburyport, but this new acquaintance soon grew tired of her and left. Maria was suddenly on her own. However, she remembered how she had managed to obtain money from the young doctor before she was married, so she returned to Boston and started working in one of the city's many brothels. Prostitution was illegal in most of the United States at the time, under the vagrancy laws, but this was not really enforced by police and city officials, who were often bribed by brothel owners and madams. There had been attempts to regulate brothels, but this was usually dismissed on the grounds that regulation would be counter to the public good. Maria wrote a note to her husband. It read, "I cannot let you know where I am, for people where I board do not know that I have got a husband. James, I feel very unsteady and will consent to live with you and keep house, but you must consent for me to have my liberty." Her husband came to Boston. He wanted to try and persuade his young wife to return, but when he discovered that she was actually earning her living in a house of ill repute, he returned home without her. She continued working there before she moved on to New Bedford. It was here that Maria met Mr. Albert Tirrell, a gentleman from a well-to-do family who resided in Weymouth. His father had been a successful shoe manufacturer, and when he died, Albert was left a very wealthy gentleman indeed. He became completely besotted by Maria, and it seemed that he would do anything for her. But he was already married and a father of 2 children. He was also a man who was no stranger to certain indiscretions. His wife had always ignored his infidelities, but this time the situation was different. His desire to stay with the beautiful Mrs. Maria Bickford was so great that he abandoned his family and rented a house in Boston where they could live. They also travelled, stayed in luxury hotels, and ate in the best restaurants. Maria had come a long way from her humble childhood. However, she would not completely give up her work in the city brothels, much to the dislike of Albert. Albert attempted to enter the publishing business in New York. He hoped to be able to publish a periodical of national recognition, one that would have great influence in the American literacy scene. He even approached Edgar Allan Poe to assist, but he declined the offer. Albert knew nothing of the publishing industry, and his venture ended in failure. Maria had her own business that she attended to, as she ran a house of assignation. This was a place where unmarried couples, or people who were conducting improper relationships, would visit and rent a room for 1 or 2 hours before going on their way. It proved to be quite popular. By now, Albert had spent most of his inheritance. This was due to his poor business investments, lavish expenditure, and complete lack of prudence. Although his generosity meant that people he met would always think well of him, and he was often described as a good fellow. With Albert now virtually out of money, the couple argued more frequently. Maria was still in contact with her husband, Mr. James Bickford, and in 1845 she sent him a letter in which she wrote that Albert was beating her and that she was now anxious to leave him. However, Albert left her in June of the same year. This is something that he had done on a number of previous occasions, although each time they had reconciled soon after. On the 29th of September, Albert was indicted on charges of adultery. However, for a while, he managed to avoid arrest. When the police eventually caught up with him, his friends and relatives wrote to the prosecutor, requesting that any prosecution may be delayed, so Albert could be given more time to improve his behaviour. It was then agreed that his trial would be delayed for 6 months. He once again tried to reunite with Maria at the House of Assignation on Cedar Lane, in the Beacon Hill area of Boston. At 5 a.m. on Monday the 27th of October 1845, Mr. Joel Lawrence, the landlord of the property that Maria rented on Cedar Lane, heard a scream, followed by a loud thud. This was coming from the upper floors of the house. He looked at his wife, who had been awoken by the noise. They then heard footsteps quickly coming down the stairs, followed by the sound of someone slamming the front door. Mr. Lawrence immediately jumped out of bed and went to see what was going on. He went to Maria's room and opened the door. The room was filled with smoke. Maria was on the bed. She was motionless and making no sound. As Mr. Lawrence looked closer, he realised that Maria Bickford was dead. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear, and there was blood visible on the walls. At the foot of the bed, there was a razor, a cane, and a gentleman's vest. There was also a letter which was initialled AJT to MAB. It was obvious that whoever had done this had tried to destroy the evidence, as there had been attempts to start a fire. Mr. Lawrence sent for the police. When they arrived, Mr. Lawrence told them that the previous evening he had seen Maria and Mr. Albert Tirrell engaged in a heated argument. He had not thought too much of it, as it was a particular common occurrence. News of the incident started to spread, and other witnesses came forward. One was a worker at the stable who told of how Mr. Albert Tirrell had come there at 5:30 in the morning and asked for a horse, saying that he had got into a little difficulty and wanted to go to the home of his wife's father. Several people had witnessed Mr. Tirrell entering and leaving the property. The police began to search for him, but Mr. Albert Tirrell had fled. He had arrived in Weymouth and then travelled to Montreal in Canada, from where he sent a letter to his family, advising them that he was going to take a boat to England. He boarded a ship bound for the port of Liverpool. Unfortunately for Albert, the weather in the Atlantic was particularly bad, and the boat was forced to turn around and sail to New York. Not to be deterred, Albert then boarded another boat, this time one that was heading to New Orleans. However, the authorities in Louisiana had been made aware of his arrival, and on the 6th of December 1845, Mr. Albert Tirrell was arrested and sent back to Boston, where he was charged with the murder of Mrs. Maria Bickford. Newspapers filled their pages with stories about Albert Tirrell. They wrote about how he had left his wife to live with Mrs. Maria Bickford, that he had lost his inherited fortune, and before Mrs. Bickford's death, he had been charged with adultery. Of course, they sensationalised the story, and the case seemed to fascinate the public. The newspapers wrote that on the morning of the crime, Albert had been seen entering and leaving the premises. Despite people previously describing him as a good fellow, Mr. Albert Tirrell was now seen as a villain. However, by the time the trial began, on the 24th of March 1846, the public opinion had somewhat changed. The people of Boston were now starting to think that Albert was just a poor victim of Maria. They believed that she had used her feminine charms to seduce him, resulting in the infatuated gentleman leaving his wife, abandoning his children, and losing his money. Albert's family hired Rufus Choate to defend him. He was a famous Boston attorney who was noted for the defence strategies that he employed to get his client acquitted. On the first day of the trial, the prosecutor, Samuel D. Parker, called many witnesses who were able to establish solid circumstantial evidence against the defendant. However, the defence countered this during cross-examination. One witness was the coroner, and the defence attorney asked if the wound to Maria Bickford's neck could have been self-inflicted. The coroner replied that it could. A lady named Miss Mary Head, who was a resident of Cedar Lane, told the court that on the 27th of October, someone knocked on her door. When she answered, she saw Albert Tirrell. She said he spoke to her, but he was in a very strange state indeed. It was as if he was asleep. Albert Tirrell's brother-in-law, a gentleman named Mr. Nathaniel Bailey, testified that when he saw the defendant in Weymouth, he was acting in a very peculiar way and told him that he was fleeing from an adultery indictment. Mr. Bailey added that when he informed him of the death of Mrs. Maria Bickford, Albert seemed to be both shocked and saddened. The prosecution had a number of witnesses who could confirm that the defendant had stayed with Maria on the night of the 26th of October and had left at around 5 a.m. But the defence questioned the reputation and credibility of these witnesses. They also had their own witnesses who informed the court that the defendant had been a fine and upstanding gentleman before his mind had become corrupted by the charms of the seductress, Mrs. Maria Bickford. The defence claimed that there was no evidence that Mr. Albert Tirrell had committed this most terrible crime. They claimed that there were other explanations to what had led to the death of the young woman. She may have taken her own life. She may have been murdered by another. Rufus Choate had one more alternative explanation as to how Maria Bickford had met her most unfortunate death. He informed the court that his client, Mr. Albert Tirrell, was an habitual sleepwalker, and that it may be possible that he did indeed murder Mrs. Bickford, but only under the influence of a nightmare or a trance. At the time, there were no medical explanations for sleepwalking, and medical experts differed over its cause. Many witnesses were then called to testify, all of whom confirmed that Albert had suffered from sleepwalking all his life. One relative told of how just a month before the terrible tragedy, Albert had entered his bedroom holding a knife, while completely unaware of what he was doing, as he was still asleep. Rufus Choate knew that the argument, suggesting that Maria's death had been caused by her own hand, was not a strong one, especially as she had died in such a savage manner. The sleepwalking defence was going to be the one that he needed to portray more to the jury. However, the theories that he had presented, and his crude description of her being an adulteress and a woman of such low moral standing, had introduced some doubt into the minds of the jury. The Boston newspapers were convinced that Albert Tirrell was guilty. They knew that Mr. Rufus Choate was a skilled attorney, but some considered his tactics unethical, and while everyone respected the gentleman's legal ability, there were those who spoke against him. One journalist wrote, "The lightnings of his genius were brandished with little regard to consequence, and that it was comparatively a matter of indifference to the great actor of the scene whether they purified the moral atmosphere by vindicating the cause of truth and justice, or struck down the fair fabric of public virtue and public integrity." In his closing arguments, Rufus Choate spoke for over 6 hours. On Monday the 30th of March, the judge summed up the case. Many believe that he showed sympathy towards the defendant, referring to Mrs. Maria Bickford's chosen profession and low moral standing. The judge also advised that sleepwalking could be considered insanity. On Monday the 30th of March, the jury was sent out to deliberate. They did so for just 2 hours and returned to inform the judge and the packed courtroom that they found the defendant not guilty. Many of the spectators stood up and applauded the decision. They also shouted their approval across the courtroom. Albert himself got rather emotional, which was not something he had done throughout the trial. The newspapers wrote that Rufus Choate had successfully defended Mr. Albert Tirrell, that if he had indeed murdered Mrs. Maria Bickford, he would only have done so while sleepwalking, and therefore was not responsible for his actions. In January 1847, Albert was once again in court, this time charged with trying to burn down the property owned by Mr. Joel Lawrence. This was also a crime that could be punishable by death. He again employed the services of Rufus Choate, and again the renowned attorney managed to secure a not guilty verdict. Albert then attempted to get half of his legal fees refunded, on the grounds that his innocence had been obvious. He was unsuccessful. He was, however, charged with adultery and lascivious cohabitation, for which he was sentenced to 3 years in prison with hard labour. After the notoriety that had been generated by his trials died down, Mr. Albert Tirrell lived the remainder of his life in obscurity. But the trials remained famous for the successful use of the sleepwalking defence. For the fourth case, we go to early 20th century Sweden. Frans Ericson was born on the 15th of April 1876 in Badelunda, just outside the city of Västerås in Sweden. However, when he was just 6 years old, his family moved to a village on the island of Adelsö, which is situated in the middle of Lake Mälaren. Life was peaceful there, but 7 years later, when young Frans was 13, the family moved back to Västerås. Frans acquired a basic education, a testament to the educational reforms in Sweden that had led to the establishment of at least one permanent school in every government district since 1842. Despite the prevalent disinterest among the parents in impoverished communities towards sending their children to school, most received some education. As Frans grew into a young man, Sweden underwent significant transformations. Its once reliance on agriculture was starting to give way to the onset of industrialization. The economy experienced growth, particularly in sectors like steel and forestry. Urban areas expanded, witnessing the emergence of people living in larger cities and a gradual departure from rural life. Social reforms gained ground, pushing for improved labour conditions and educational opportunities. Amidst these changes, cultural pursuits like literature and the arts quietly thrived, mirroring a society in the midst of evolution. When Frans left school, he became an apprentice with a local baker, and although he seemed to like his work, in the 1890s many young people left their homes and went to live in Stockholm. The beautiful city, with its historic centre, was a captivating blend of medieval charm and architectural elegance. Cobblestone streets, weaved through well-preserved buildings, adorned with vibrant facades, while historic landmarks, like the Royal Palace and Stockholm Cathedral, stood as testaments to the city's rich heritage. There was an enchanting atmosphere as people would stroll through the narrow alleys and explore a tapestry of history which was seamlessly woven into Stockholm's urban fabric. There were also factories and new industries that provided better opportunities for the young. Like many men in late 19th century Sweden, Frans embarked on a journey that led him to Stockholm. Here, over the next few years, he worked in various bakeries, yet despite the cultural grandeur of the city, after a while he decided to leave. He then travelled approximately 65 kilometres south to the quaint town of Gnesta. He did not stay there long, and instead tried his luck in the coastal town of Ubala, situated beside the Baltic Sea, 640 kilometres from Stockholm. Things were not so easy for him there, as despite his proficiency as a baker, he encountered difficulties securing employment, and eventually he found work in a local store. In September 1900, while still living in Ubala, he borrowed a suit from a friend, which for some reason he failed to return, and this resulted in the friend reporting him to the local police. Frans was then arrested, charged with shoplifting and embezzlement, and following a subsequent court case, was found guilty. He was then sentenced to 2 months in prison. After his release, life seemed to go downhill for the young man. He became very poor and began to live as a vagrant. Things got worse when on the 8th of July 1904, he was once again arrested for shoplifting, this time for stealing clothes. He was again sent to court, tried and found guilty. He was then sentenced to another 2 months imprisonment. However, Frans's time spent in prison proved ineffective in dissuading him from his criminal tendencies. In January 1905, under the influence of alcohol, he and a friend stole 3 cans of lobster in the town of Sollefteå. He was then arrested, and this was followed by yet another appearance in court, where he once again was found guilty. Unfortunately, due to his prior convictions, the judge sentenced him to 14 months in prison to be served in the city of Harnesund. Upon his release, Frans resumed his nomadic lifestyle, perpetually on the move. In July 1907, he found a semblance of stability, securing employment at a baker's shop in Vredstrup. Despite the owner's satisfaction with his work, 2 years later, in 1909, the allure of change beckoned again, and he uprooted his life once more, this time moving to the city of Ericson. Ericson was small, but very picturesque, and stood on the southern shores of a lake, which was surrounded by many villages. Frans settled in the village of Heerden, where he found lodgings with two individuals, a woman named Kjerstis Karinolfsdotter and a man named Friedrich Alfred Vestlund. However, Kjerstis carried a controversial reputation in the village. She was believed by many to be living a promiscuous life, which cast a shadow on her standing within the community. During this period, church attendance was a prevalent practice amongst Swedes, driven by the Lutheran Church's central role as a dominant faith. While urbanisation had introduced diversity and varying levels of religious engagement in the cities, in the close-knit village of Heden, most of the people consistently attended Sunday services, reflecting the strong religious ties within rural communities. Kjerstis Dotter was told of an 83-year-old former corporal in the Swedish army named Daniel Dunder, who lived in the village with his 75-year-old wife named Kirsten, and who had recently sold their last cow to a neighbour and had received quite a lot of money. Kjerstis was living a poor life, and although local communities and churches often played a crucial role in providing aid to those in need, she was looked down upon by many people in the village. She told Friedrich and Frans about the money that Daniel Dunder and his wife had secured, and together they devised a plan to rob the elderly couple. To conceal their crime, the trio opted for a methodical approach. They went to the couple's house, where Friedrich, fraying neighbourly goodwill, entered their home, and after engaging in a pleasant conversation, offered to prepare them a cup of coffee. But the coffee he gave the Dunders was laced with arsenic. Meanwhile, Frans and Kjerstis stood guard outside, with no means of escaping the house, and the elderly couple's cries going unanswered, they succumbed to a painful death. After seizing the money, Kjerstis, Frederick and Frans, recognising the need to erase any trace of their dark deed, deviously manipulated the crime scene to appear as though the Dunders had perished from carbon monoxide poisoning. They lit a fire, closed the doors, and left the house, leaving behind a staged tragedy to mask their sinister act. The bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Dunder were soon found by a concerned neighbour. The police were called and hurriedly arrived to inspect the harrowing scene. Although they considered carbon monoxide poisoning was a possible cause of death, this theory was soon discarded in favour of a more sinister possibility: murder. This conclusion would set off a chain of events that would unravel a chilling tale of deceit. The rapid escalation of suspicion pointed unwaveringly at Frans Ericson, Kjerstis Olsdotter and Friedrich Vestlund, culminating with their swift arrest within days of the terrible discovery. Their newfound notoriety plunged them into the cold confines of the Fallu prison, where the weight of their alleged crimes cast a sombre shadow over what should have been a festive season. Christmas, typically a time of warmth and celebration, presented an entirely contrasting experience for the accused individuals as they were faced with the harsh reality of incarceration. The trial commenced in Ericson on the 10th of January 1910. The prevailing sentiment throughout the city suggested a unanimous belief in their guilt. The police in particular had singled out Kjerstis Olsdotter as the alleged mastermind behind the heinous crime. She was a woman already burdened by poverty, who carried a tarnished reputation among the local community, which further fueled the suspicion against her. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. The court believed that Friedrich Vestlund, a man of limited financial means, had displayed an unquestionable level of meticulous planning in collaboration with Jestis. He had entered the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Dunda under the guise of neighbourly hospitality. He then had served them coffee, cunningly laced with arsenic. His malevolent actions revealed during the trial led the judge to also sentence him to death, and thus confirming the severity of his involvement in the chilling plot. Frans Ericson was also found guilty, but instead of the death penalty, he received a life sentence in prison. The sentences were appealed, but initially all the appeals were rejected. Jestis Olsdotter and Friedrich Westlund had requested that their sentences be commuted, but on the 15th of July 1910, this appeal was denied. They would both face the guillotine. Jestis was aware that the last woman executed in Sweden was Anna Mansdotter. She had been beheaded on the 7th of August 1890 for her involvement in the murder of her daughter-in-law, but it was well known that Sweden had not executed a woman for 20 years. In the early 20th century, the country saw a growing movement against capital punishment. This was influenced by evolving moral standards and a commitment to human rights. Intellectuals, reformers, and progressive organisations spearheaded the anti-death penalty sentiment. San Marino had been the first European country to end capital punishment in 1865. Portugal followed 2 years later, ending the death penalty for civil crimes. And in 1870, the Netherlands had abolished capital punishment. However, Sweden continued to execute people for certain crimes, but in 1907 had changed the method of doing so from beheading by axe to beheading by guillotine. Despite their initial appeals being denied, on the 28th of October 1910, a twist of fate occurred when the sentence against both prisoners was commuted to life imprisonment. Jestis was sent to the women's prison in Vaxhög, while the confines of justice saw the two men, Frans and Friedrich, serving their sentence in Långholmen prison in Stockholm. In January 1916, Frans was transferred to the prison in Malmö, where he continued to refuse to accept that his sentence was fair. His time behind bars was fraught with numerous challenges. His volatile nature resulted in frequent conflicts, which hampered any chance of clemency through appeal. A brief respite emerged in 1922, when he was transferred to a low-security prison in Mariestad, affording him the opportunity to work with horses. Despite persistent efforts, Frans faced limited success in his pursuit of being released. Appeals in 1925, 1926, 1928, and 1929 were all met with rejection. However, a breakthrough finally transpired on the 31st of October 1930, when his fifth clemency request was granted. Friedrich Alfred Westlund was also granted clemency, and he too was released from prison. Frans' newfound freedom was bittersweet. He secured work as a labourer at a farm near Stockholm, but now 55 years old, he struggled with the demanding physical labour, and this was exacerbated by his battle with paranoia. His taste of liberty was tainted by the challenges of his age and his mental health, which made the path of reintegration into society quite challenging. In 1953, his journey came to an end, as ill health resulted in him being admitted into a nursing home. A few months later, on the 7th of June, he died of cancer. After initially being interred by the prison, he found his final resting place in the Schichtkrokogården cemetery on the 20th of January 1954. Thank you all so much for listening, and of course, making it to the end. I hope you enjoyed this compilation video, but please let me know by leaving any feedback or comments you may have, and I hope to see you all again next week for another brief case